Hey everyone, I just want to give you a few notes to help you to read through some of the articles that you're going to be reading. We're starting off with some CQ Researcher articles, and you'll get a chance to read more on your own later on. So I want to kind of provide you with an overview of how you should be reading each one of these articles. So this presentation will cover steps for thinking critically as you read through each one of the articles, and also it will explain how to identify logical fallacies and then hopefully later on avoid committing those logical fallacies in your own writing. So first and foremost, there are a lot of steps for reading critically, and you don't have to memorize all of them or try to apply every single one of them as you're reading, but it is helpful. So again, if you want to take some notes on this, that would probably be the best way for you to remember all of these things. But again, if you want to refer to them, they are also in your book. So the first step for reading critically is to preview the reading. After that, you'll want to skim through the reading, consider your own experience, annotate the reading, summarize the reading, analyze and evaluate the reading, argue with the reading, create a debate and dialogue between two or more readings, construct a debate, and then finally deliberate about the readings. Now, all of these steps can kind of be boiled down into the concept of a courtroom. So if you think about how the court process works, I know many of you have probably seen those courtroom dramas, and it's very similar to that. So two opposing sides will kind of sit down next to each other. If you want to think of it as the pro and con section of a CQ Researcher article, or a political situation where you have two opposing sides in a political debate, your Democrats and Republicans, or whatever the case may be. That is kind of how every article starts, how you should approach every single article, and how you should read, analyze, synthesize all of the material that you cover in this course. So after each side has kind of presented their viewpoint, then it is up to the judge and jury to deliberate about that, everything that they've heard, and decide whether and who they believe, basically, in the end. And so this is it can be a really complicated process, but at the same time, you are the jury ultimately, or you are the judge if we were going in a trial that's judge alone. Then you are ultimately the one who's going to decide which side you believe, or if you believe a little bit of one side and a little bit of the other, then when you sit down to write your paper, you'll need to put together your thoughts in a way that conveys to your reader that you either agree wholeheartedly with one side, agree wholeheartedly with the other side, or that you find yourself somewhere in the middle, and then provide reasons why you feel that way. So start every single journal article, and that is journal, newspaper, magazine article that you read from any of the databases, any of MCC's databases, by previewing the reading. So pre-reading. This is kind of taking a look at the title, for instance, any background information or biographical information on the author. Who is the writer? Where was the article originally published? That can give you a lot of information just right there. So the author, for instance, may have some sort of a political affiliation. If they do, and they're writing an article about politics, then you have a general idea of where they're going to stand on this particular issue, or you can make a pretty good assumption about how they're going to write this article. Where was the article originally published? If it's in a conservative versus liberal news magazine, or a newspaper, or perhaps if it was published in a very conservative journal or a liberal journal, whatever, that again will give you an idea. A journal, for instance, that is purely conservative will never really accept an entry from someone who writes an extremely liberal article about something. So you have a pretty good idea just by covering those two things or answering those two questions, what you are going to learn or read once you start reading through the article. When was the article published? This is really important specifically for this class because I do want to make sure that you are only including information in your own work that has been published within the last 5 years. Additionally, it can give you some insight into the opinions of the time period. So the concept is referred to as a Zeitgeist. It is a German word that literally means the spirit of the time period. So for instance, if you are reading something about the civil rights movement during the time of the civil rights movement, it may be very difficult or very different regarding the wording and the opinions than an article that was published, for instance, today regarding the civil rights movement and looking backward to the events that happened in the past. And that is the case with lots of different things. With us having a 24-hour news cycle at this point, it is really important that you make sure that you have the most current information because things change very, very quickly. And even within a 24-hour period, something can go from, for instance, hearing about Hillary Clinton during the campaign in 2016, she was sick, and that was the only news that we got. And then, she passed out, or she wobbled and passed out or something. And then 24 hours after that, that video was released of her kind of wobbling near the car and that kind of thing. She had walking pneumonia, and so we had a diagnosis within 24 hours. That shows you how the 24-hour news cycle actually works and how quickly we can get accurate information about something that is going on, and it completely overshadows the little bits of information that we had to start. And again, that can be the case with lots of different things because of our 24-hour news cycle. So, last step in previewing the reading, what does the title reveal about the subject and the author's attitude toward it? And again, this is something that your book kind of goes into detail about. It kind of explains this. Do they use positive or negative language in the title? Because that, again, is sort of a dead giveaway as to the author's opinion about the topic. From there, make sure that you skim through the reading. So get a general idea of the subject and the intent. Find its basic features. Again, this may include the title, any kind of a thesis that the author may have set up within the first couple of sentences or at the end of the first paragraph. For your purposes, your thesis is always going to be the last sentence of your first paragraph. So that is a really important point to make and for you to follow my not a suggestion, but the instruction there to make sure that your thesis is the last sentence of the first paragraph. So by the time I get to the last sentence of your introduction, I should know exactly what the rest of your essay is going to be about. So that would be a very basic feature. In addition to that, you want to make sure that each one of your topic sentences refers back to your thesis in some way, shape, or form. So once you've established your thesis, if you have 3 points, if you have 4 points, if you have 5 points, however long the paper happens to be, then I should be able to identify the topic sentence, the first sentence of each paragraph, and go, oh, okay, well, you made that point in your thesis, and I can see how you're going to explain in this paragraph the point that you made originally in your thesis. So discover that topic or claim in the thesis statement that the author makes in the thesis statement, and then try to identify the topic sentences from there. Consider your own experience. So bring your own perspective, experience, education, and personal values to your reading. Again, you may have a different political affiliation than the author, or you may have a different religious affiliation than the author. So take that into consideration. How do you feel? How does the group that you belong to feel about this particular topic? Ask yourself the following questions. What do I know about this subject? In some cases, the answer may be nothing. I don't know anything about it. which is a really wonderful place to be in, and you should never be afraid to say, I don't know anything at all about this topic, and then learn something about it. What have I heard or read about it recently? And again, the answer may be nothing. You may not have heard anything at all recently about the topic that you happen to be reading about. And again, that is a very good position to be in because it provides you with a blank slate. You are a blank slate, and you can kind of absorb, or you're a dry sponge. You can absorb all of the information and then decide what you want to do with it. What attitudes or opinions do I have about this subject? And again, most of us have some sort of an attitude or opinion that is guided by our politics, our religion, our beliefs in, or lack thereof, in each subject. From there, you can annotate the reading. Annotating is basically just responding to the ideas in the reading right on the pages of your text. So if you come across a journal article and you want to save trees and and conserve the environment, then you may want to just type up your response. If not, if you actually want to print out a page, or if you are reading something in a book and you own the book and you want to highlight, then you can highlight, you can underline, you can write questions in the margins. If something is unfamiliar to you, you write a little question that you can go back and answer, perhaps with another journal article or another book or something. Circle unfamiliar words or phrases. I do this too, and again, this is nothing to be ashamed about. If for some reason you don't know a word that the authors used in the text, then look it up. Write it down somewhere or type it into dictionary.com right away and look up the word. I recommend that all of you keep a vocabulary journal. Again, this is something that I do so that I can remember things, because I have mommy brain like 99% of the day. And so if I don't write it down, or if I don't make myself a note about it to go back and look at it, then I'll forget. So I do have a little journal. I have a digital journal because I do like to not kill trees. But I keep it in, Google Keep, or I keep a little note, or I set a reminder for myself in my Google Calendar to go back when I do have time and look up these unfamiliar words. Draw lines between related ideas. Again, if it's a journal article or a newspaper article or magazine article, oftentimes it's short enough that you can find either conflicting ideas right away, or you can find similar ideas right away, and you can just draw lines in between those two things. Note where the writer's use of transitions and qualifiers. Note the writer's use of transitions and qualifiers that subtly change the meaning. So it may be that the author starts off by presenting one side of the argument and then uses some sort of clever transition to start talking about and presenting the opposing side. So make sure that you pay attention to that in the writing and things that you read, so that when you write, you can kind of mimic that same transition. Use arrows or asterisks to point out particularly persuasive examples, because again, you can use those things. You can quote directly. You learned how to summarize already, so you can provide a summary. You can paraphrase the author's work, whatever you need to do in order to be able to use that information in a way that doesn't plagiarize in your own work later on. Mark difficult to understand sections. Again, this is something that we can discuss during office hours if you want to go over a particularly difficult section, or if you want to go back and just read it one more time to get a better understanding, or if you want to run it by one of your classmates. Just go ahead and highlight or mark that particular difficult section and see if someone can help you with clarity. Summarizing the reading. Again, this is something that you've already practiced at this point in the semester, so I won't talk too much about it, but summarizing is basically just a type of writing that's used to capture the essential meaning of a reading by focusing only on the writer's main points. So it is shorter than the original, it is in your own words, it is completely objective, which means that it doesn't include your opinion at all, it is accurate, and it is thorough. So it may have some direct quotes. If you are using a direct quote, you should almost always use an in-text citation, and I provided you with a link to the Purdue OWL website to learn more about how to use in-text citations, but you want to be as thorough as possible so that, again, your reader understands that you are summarizing something and that you haven't left anything of importance out. Next step, analyze and evaluate the reading. To analyze is to break something down into separate parts, examine those parts closely, and evaluate their significance and how they work together as a whole. For instance, what are the writer's assumptions? And again, you can kind of glean what the writer's assumptions are based on some of the just the bare bones of the article that you happen to be reading. So again, you can figure that out maybe just in their thesis statement. It may not get much further than just the first paragraph. What kind of audience is the writer addressing? Again, you can get this information a lot of times just by the place or the place of publication. So if it's published again in a conservative journal, then you know that the writer is probably going to be addressing a friendly audience. They may also be addressing a different kind of audience, and they will adjust their language based on the kind of audience that they're going to be addressing. Again, your book breaks down all the different kinds of audiences, and so you can read about it more in there. What are the writer's purpose and intention? How well does the writer accomplish this purpose? You, once you've read through a few of these articles, are going to be able to notice whether or not the writer was successful in their attempt to persuade the audience. What kinds of evidence has the writer used? Do they use direct quotes? Do they paraphrase? Do they use or quote from scientific studies? Or do they provide just anecdotal information? How convincing is this evidence? This is basically just your opinion. Did you think the author was convincing or not? Does the writer's logic seem reasonable? Did the writer address opposing views? You as a writer should absolutely always address the opposing views, even if the person that you're reading doesn't do that. It does look much better if you address the opposing side and start to try to think like the opposing side. So think like your adversary or think like your opponent in order to really get in their head and answer their questions or refute their arguments before they even get a chance to do that. And then finally, overall, is the writer persuasive? Yes, no, maybe. Argue with the reading. Make sure that you are asking all of the questions that I've just provided for you and more. Challenge the writer's assumptions. Look out for logical fallacies, and I'll talk about those in just a minute, but they're basically just instances where the writer distorts or exaggerates evidence or relies on faulty logic to make a point. Create a debate and dialogue between two or more readings. So once you've had a chance to really digest one reading and you've gotten an idea of the author's position, try to find one that directly contradicts some of the points that they make. Look at the ideas you find in the readings to see how they compare and contrast with one another. You don't actually have to write any compare and contrast essays in this class, but you'll want to use that conflicting information to present the opposing point in your own essays. Construct a debate. Consider the differences, consider the commonalities, and create a dialogue. So if these two authors sat down next to each other, what would they say? Try to find point by point areas where each author says one thing and then an opposing thing about that same topic. Deliberate about the readings. Arrive at your own conclusions. And this is, I can't stress this enough, this is really, really important to make sure that you arrive at your own conclusions. Your point of view is very important, and you shouldn't just agree because without having any sort of reasons to back that up. Consider the writer's claims and main points. Define your own position on the issue. And again, this can only come from reading articles on both sides of the argument. And logical fallacies. So there are a lot of logical fallacies to look out for. Again, I don't expect you to remember all of them, but you can refer to your book whenever you need to, if you think that you see a logical fallacy, you may want to look it up and see if that's what you're actually seeing. So, you have an example here of Plato, Socrates, and Aristotle, so the fathers of rhetoric, of our modern rhetorical studies, and it says, "Thou shalt not commit logical fallacies." And I really, really, really hope that you all avoid using these logical fallacies. And once you've seen them in other articles or in other books, then they become easier and easier to identify, and almost to a humorous extent. So I'll try my best to make this light, because again, there are a lot of these. Ad hominem argument, ad misericordiam argument, ad populum argument, bandwagon appeal, begging the question, circular reasoning, dicto simpliciter, false analogy, false dilemma, faulty use of authority, hasty generalization, non sequitur, post hoc ergo propter hoc, red herring, slippery slope, stacking the deck, and straw man. And these are just the ones that your book identifies. So, starting at the beginning with your ad hominem is a personal attack on an opponent rather than on the opponent's views. And your little cartoon example here, debate strategy, win arguments with an ad hominem attack. No, your face is a logical fallacy. So instead of attacking the person based on their position on an issue, you attack the person instead. This we saw again a lot. We see it a lot in politics in general. We saw it a lot with the debates between Hillary Clinton and President Trump, now President Trump, candidate Trump back then. But we saw this when he would say things like, she didn't look presidential. Well, she may not look like much of anything at all to a lot of people, but that doesn't really have anything to do with her policies or any of the arguments that she made for different things as they came up throughout the debates. So that is not very effective. It's something that we can kind of jump on as viewers, but it's not necessarily anything that has to do with the policies that should be important to us. So that's just kind of one example of an ad hominem logical fallacy. Ad misericordiam is the appeal to pity. So feel sorry for me. Believe me because you feel sorry for me. Ad populum, an appeal to the supposed prejudices and emotions of the masses or to the people. We see this a lot right now with different groups. So trying to appeal to certain people, getting them afraid, for instance, of immigrants or of Muslims or of Christians or of insert threatening group here or seemingly threatening group there. And they want you to agree with that. So it's kind of making someone afraid of something in order to convince them. Other logical fallacies, your bandwagon appeal. We heard the expression jumping on the bandwagon. It's an appeal to the sense of belonging to the group and behaving like the majority. Begging the question, passes off as true an assumption that needs to be proven. Circular reasoning, the conclusion of a deductive argument is hidden in the premise of that argument. This is basically just, it is what it is. Well, but what is it? And you never really get to the solution there. Dicto simpliciter, from the general truth to a specific case regardless of the qualifications of the latter, or spoken simply. This is sort of a hasty generalization. You get really, really quickly to something. If it sounds too good to be true, then it probably is. If it's too simple, then there's probably something wrong with it. Your false analogy, when ideas being compared do not logically connect or are pressed beyond legitimacy. False dilemma, the simplification of complex issues into an either-or choice. We get this a lot. We do this a lot as parents with our children, that if it's too difficult to explain to our children, you just have to choose one or the other. So there's that. More logical fallacies. Faulty use of authority. Use of someone who is an expert in one area as an authority for another unrelated area. Just because somebody is a doctor doesn't necessarily mean that they're an expert in the field. And this little cartoon here explains exactly that. But why should we switch to the buffer solution? Because I'm the lab head and I said so. So why are we switching to the buffer solution? Because I'm the postdoc and I said so. So just because somebody has has doctor in front of their name, they could be a PhD, and you're asking them to testify to something that only an MD would have any real life experience with or authority on. So be careful when you're reading through things like that, and try to avoid just assuming that someone is an authority on something just because they are a doctor or so and so. I did this a lot when I first started conducting research, and I would find things by like Dr. Spock, who does back in the day, wrote a lot about parenting and things like that, and it's kind of comical now, because I feel like he had a lot of stuff on parenting, but also on other topics as well that he probably was not very savvy about. Hasty generalization, arriving at a conclusion based on too little evidence. You always want to make sure that you have lots and lots of evidence and lots of really good evidence before you make an assumption or a claim. Non sequitur draws a conclusion that does not follow logically from the premise. More logical fallacies. Post hoc ergo propter hoc. After this, therefore, because of this, establishing a questionable cause and effect relationship between events. Red herring, evidence that is maliciously used to distract the audience from the true issues of an argument. And you see my little red herring over there. I'm here to distract you. It's literally the squirrel. So something runs across the screen, and all of a sudden you're distracted and you have no idea what the original argument was, and you just agree because you want to get the situation over with. It literally comes from the idea of throwing a fish into a situation to distract someone. This happens a lot in movies and on TV shows with babies and puppies and monkeys. Monkeys, I think a lot happened in a theater back in the day, but it is to distract the audience for a moment from the real issues. Slippery slope presumes one event will inevitably lead to a chain of other events that end in catastrophe. So a couple of good examples of this. One would be the snowball effect. So you start off with a rock at the top of a hill, and then as the rock tumbles down, suddenly there's a huge avalanche, and it cripples an entire town. Like, everyone's wiped out. The childhood example of this is if you give a mouse a cookie. It's a really simple premise. The story just starts off with, if you give a mouse a cookie, then he's going to want some milk. And then it gets kind of crazy after that, and the mouse ends up like moving in and staying and invites friends over. If you've ever seen the TV show, it's wild. So, it's absolute madness in the house because, yeah, I won't spoil the ending for you, but don't give a mouse a cookie. The other example of this, if you let a bully come in your front yard, he will be on your porch the next day, and the day after that, he will eat your babies. So that escalated quickly. Yeah, avoid doing that. It's a slippery slope. Okay. Stacking the deck, only providing evidence that supports the writer's premise while disregarding or withholding contrary evidence. You absolutely want to avoid doing this. I am going to take points off if you do anything like this. And that's why I'm telling you now that you need to make sure that you examine both sides of the argument and that you present both sides of the argument. And you pay really close attention to the transition between those two parts of any paper. Presenting your position and then transitioning into presenting the opposing side, and then going back and rebutting the opposing side. In your rebuttal, you can potentially concede to a few things that are good logical points, but mostly you want to make sure that you've just presented the opposing side in a way that doesn't deliberately disregard or withhold any contrary evidence from the reader. Straw man, a strategy of refuting another person's actual position by substituting an exaggerated or distorted version of that position. And again, you have a little cartoon here. And given my contributions to this paper, I think that I deserve to share credit with the first author. So fame is more important to you than science, huh? That's sad. What? I didn't say that. Oh, so now I'm senile too. So that's a little bit of an exaggerated position. All right, so that is a look at reading arguments. Again, kind of starting off with your title at the very, very beginning, previewing or pre-reading, skimming through the article, and going more and more in depth, trying your best to identify as many of those logical fallacies as you possibly can. Once you are able to identify them, it makes it a lot easier to either use the ones that are useful and or avoid the ones that you can avoid when you start writing yourself, because I want you all to do your absolute very best to avoid logical fallacies, because every time you commit a logical fallacy, a robot takes over the world. That's a logical fallacy.